Okay, welcome everyone to this panel organized by the History and Political Economy of Business and Finance Research Cluster about Brexit and COVID-19, what lies ahead for UK capitalisms. And we are pleased to have here Dr. Dimitris Sotiropoulos and Professor Leslie Budd. Dr. Dimitris Sotiropoulos is a senior lecturer in finance at the Open University Business School and director of the research cluster. And prior to that, he worked as a lecturer and researcher in academic institutions in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Greece. And his research covers different topics in the political economy of capitalism, history of financial innovation, and the history of economic thought. Professor Leslie Budd is professor of regional economy and at the Open University Business School and director of the research cluster Space Exploration, Analysis and Research. He is also an economist internationally known for his work on regional and urban economics in the context of global issues, the digital economy, and the socioeconomic impacts of Brexit. Leslie is currently visiting professor at the Center for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University, and formerly Special Economic Advisor to the Committee for Enterprise, Trade and Investment at the Northern Ireland Assembly. So this evening, we will go first with the presentation by Dimitris. Then we will have a presentation by Les, and we will have, hopefully, an hour or so for a Q&A at the end. So if you, I suggest to you to leave some questions that you might have in the chat box for later, so I can collect them and we can have a discussion after the presentation. Thank you. So Dimitris, the floor is yours, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Okay, thanks Daniele. Please try to stop me at 20-25 minutes. So the idea is to have its presentation within 30 minutes and then have, half an hour or so for discussion. So the questions and discussion will take place in the end. So I'll go first and then Les will follow. This panel is interesting and it's in line with these research seminars of HYPE, which they try to use political economy and history in order to discuss important contemporary questions. And I think that the timing is perfect now to discuss about, Brexit and COVID-19. And the reason is that, it's been almost a year since the pandemic went on, and many things have happened since then. And now we have, a vaccination program and vaccines that, they work one way or another. So there is some sort of optimism or a wave of optimism, and we can see a little bit the light in the end of the tunnel. And the other issue is that so far the pandemic or the management of the pandemic has been the ultimate priority for governments in different countries all over the world, which means now the priority is different and perhaps some important issues will come to the forefront and they will define the debates and the political conflict in the next years or perhaps more. And I think it's time for us to start discussing or start raising questions and ideas. So my presentation will be about fiscal expansion and will be about sovereign debt. And what I will try to do is I will try to just raise some questions and try to predict, not to predict, but try to set a little bit the discussion of what we need to have in mind from the next for the next period. So it's not so much a prediction, but it's about an attempt to set the framework of the discussion. This figure gives us an idea of the size of the fiscal expansion, and it shows government debt as ratio to GDP for different selected countries. These are developed capitalist countries in different years. So the first year is 2007, just before the global financial meltdown, and the next one is 2019, which is just before the outbreak of the pandemic, and 21 is a forecast according to IMF, based on the data of October 2020. So these estimations are a bit optimist of the size. So the fiscal expansion will be better. So this is before the big fiscal stimulus discussed in the US or the extra lockdown in the UK. So the picture might be even worse. As you can see, a significant amount of countries now have reached or have passed the level of 100% of debt. And those of you who remember the discussions, 15 years ago in 2007 on the IMF, so 100% level of debt was the absolute threshold. So, and I do remember many papers and reports saying that, if debt goes beyond that, it will be a catastrophe, it will be a burden for the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are. So 2007, from the perspective of today, looks like a heaven, looks like, a wealth, healthy situation. If we just leave out of the discussion Japan and Greece, which are, different countries in their own rights, you can see that, it's like, if we see Italy or US or even the United Kingdom. So the level of both the fiscal expansion at the debt is it's huge. Going back in time, this is the nominal debt as ratio to GDP for UK. So it goes back to 100 years, and it gives you the profile of the debt dynamics. And as you can see, we've been there or we've been worse. And this is just one example under special circumstances, which was in the UK, in the figure we see was World War I and World War II. And, there can be ways to get out of this condition. So I will get back to this example later in my presentation. Another interesting thing is that talking about priorities, all this obsession with fiscal discipline has somehow not been a priority anymore. So the idea, if you read the press, these are some headlines from Financial Times. There's also the emphasis that, now it's the time. No, it's not the time to worry about public debt. It's not the time to worry about, deficits, expansion, etc. Now it's the time to deal with the pandemic. And, there's a series of papers trying to make this, or editorials trying to make this point, not just in the Financial Times, but from organizations, etc. So restoring UK growth is more urgent than cutting public debt. Now is not the time to worry about the UK debt burden, and so on. This was a great headline, global economy, the week that austerity was officially buried. And these were, based on statements and reports of the IMF. But, the whole idea, and I think this is a quotation from this article in Financial Times, and this is a quotation, it's a comment by Carmen Reinhardt, says that first you worry about fighting the war, and then you figure out how to pay for it. So, and I think that this is a turning point. So far, everything looked like a heaven. So there was reassurance from the government that, there will be intervention, there will be supports. No one is going to stay, unsupported in the economy, firms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying the process it was not perfect, but it was a different tone from what we're used to. And now that the pandemic is getting back to normality, so we are getting gradually out of it. So this priority will change. So this is from now on that the question will gradually shift from fighting the pandemic into how to pay for it. And talking about how to pay for it, I think that it's very useful to set somehow the basis of the discussion. So let's look, this is a simple ex post and accounting identity. It's not a causal relationship, it's the identity of that describes, factors that affect the growth of debt. All figures in this equation are ratios to GDP. So D is debt as ratio to GDP. So, and simply we see that, S is the primary surplus. So basically is income minus expense without taking taxes into consideration. So the more income you have in relation to expenses, the more able you are to reduce the debts. This term here is very important. I will get back to it. Shows that R is the effective the nominal effective interest rate, which is the interest that a government pays as a ratio to accumulated debt. So it's a version of an interest rate. It's a nominal ratio. P is the inflation. G is the real growth rate. So it says that high interest rates increase the debt, whereas inflation or real growth reduces the debt as steadens. And stock flow adjustment is an accounting term that happens sometimes because of certain conditions. And then you have the change in the monetary base, which is simply like, the central bank buys sovereign debt, and you have just an automatic increase in the monetary base, part of what's going on at the moment. So from a purely, this is not a causal, and there are a lot of endogeneity between these different terms, but from a purely accounting point of view, these are the basic factors that explain the drive or the long-term drive of sovereign indebtedness and fiscal expansion. So what I will try to do in the few minutes that I have is I will try to use this framework in order to answer for questions, which will be important, and then I will get to a conclusion. So the first question is that, can we grow ourselves out of debt? And the answer is that historically it's possible. If we get back to the example of UK, during a period in which we had, a mountain of debts, we can see a very interesting thing. So we can use this example historical example, in order to draw some basic conclusions. So if we look in the periods of 1921 and 1938, which is after the end of World War I and before the beginning of World War II. So if we look at the interwar periods, we can see that debt didn't fall. The interest rate was at the level of 4.2%. Inflation was 0. The real growth was 3%, which is, according to contemporary standards, seems like a great result. But the combination of these terms were positive, and a positive combination is not enough to reduce the debt. And as we can see also, the primary surplus was 6% for that period, which is huge. It's unimaginable according to current circumstances. I will get back to this issue later, which was not enough as a condition in order to have any effect or any long-term effect to debts. So if we go back to the post-World War II period, we can see that pretty much the data are the same. So the R, the nominal interest rate, is the same, and the growth is the same. We're talking 20 years between 1950 and 1970, which was the years in which, the debt was significantly reduced. But the difference was inflation. So inflation, or average inflation for this period, went from 0.0% in the interwar period to 4%, and this make a big difference. And this was the major driver of the fall of debt. And despite the fact that the primary surplus was 2.4%, which was still high, but significantly lower than the 6% of the interwar period, it shows two things. First, that primary surplus, or let's say austerity or fiscal consolidation, is not a very strong condition in order to deal with the debt in the long term. And what makes sense is the growth and inflation dynamics. And what makes the difference in these two cases is the so-called financial depression. So financial depression is a term that describes the period after World War II. The basic let's say, variable that defines financial depression is the real interest rate. So this was a period of very, very low real interest rates. So inflation and interest rate is not a policy instrument. So governments or central bank cannot say, you know, I will put inflation to that level or I will put debt to that level. So in order for these things to happen, and we're talking about this period here, several conditions or institutional conditions were put in place. The first was the situation of the global capitalism. So it's not something that happened in an individual country. It was a special condition of the global capitalism after World War II. And in the UK, this took the form of banks holding treasury bills. Just to give you one example, in the end of the war, 40% of the debt was held by banks, and the other 40% was non-marketable, which, you know, is a great condition if you are, you know, if you, I think, from the viewpoint of the government. There were controls of interest rates, credit restrictions, foreign exchange controls, etc. So all this, the combination of these factors, you know, gave this result. But the outcome is that fiscal consolidation is not a strong condition, and in order to deal with this huge amount of debt, one way or another, you will have to have some sort of financial repression. So I will get back to these points. So let's look how things are today. So this is a table that shows the interest rate in 2019, the real growth in the last 10 years, so from 2010 to 2019, that is after the crisis, safely after the crisis and before the pandemic, and also the primary surplus during this period. So the examples that I don't have time to go through those details, but it says that if things stay like they are, and given a modest inflation, so it could take for ages for this growth and inflation to have effects of that. So if we look at the primary surplus, and let's just look the case of the UK. So for the whole period between 2010 and 2019, the average primary surplus was negative, which means that even if we imagine, you know, a huge fiscal adjustment of the level of, let's say, 5 to 6%, which, you know, will be a tremendous change in the way that we live in the UK. Even that will not be enough for a long-term solution of the debt. And, you know, there are some very important questions that we need to discuss. So how ready are, you know, UK or the UK or other Western capital societies for a next, you know, huge round of austerity? Because this is what the governments will try to do in the next phase. Or is there any way to have a progressive taxation? Is there room for, you know, progressive fiscal adjustment? So these are questions that, you know, at some point, you know, we need to try to tackle, to address. So I will leave it now for the discussion. I will go next to the rest of the slides. So the other question is that, is actually the level of debt a problem? And the answer is no, because what we see here is like a sui generis financial repression taking place. So this shows the long-term real bond yields for government bonds for several countries, and as you can see, you know, they have reached negative levels. So it seems that the existing condition is a sui generis condition of financial repression, but without capital controls or interest rate ceilings. It's like, let's say, financial repression with open markets, which is a quite unique situation. And if it stays like that, it has many implications in the way that the economy and the financial system is run, but also specific implications for the dynamics of sovereign debt. And here's the dilemma. So if we reverse, if we move out from this, you know, financial repression as it appears today, the problem of fiscal expansion and debt will become unsustainable, will become severe. But if we stay as it is, then it will have significant effects in other parts of the economy that at some point we need to consider, and I will get back to these discussions. So the final question I will try to ask is, in the top of the agenda today. So is fiscal expansion inflationary? So is inflation a big danger for, Western capitalist societies? And, in order to answer to this question, we need to have a theory of inflation in mind. And, there have been many different theories and models put forward in history. And all these models try to figure out the connection between fiscal expansion, aggregate demand, and inflation. So you can have, the post-Keynesian version, which says that aggregate demand is not inflationary. We have, growth effects, and the reverse theory, which is the quantitative theory of money, saying that aggregate demand, if you reach full capacity, will be inflationary, or other monetarist approaches, in the sense that there are rational expectations of inflation, so you're not fool individuals, etc., etc., etc. So I mean, there's been thousands of tons of ink spent for all these debates, and try to tackle the question of what happens in the future with regard to inflation. But as I said, this is a war-like condition, and this is a special circumstance. And when you are in a special circumstance, you need to have a way to think outside the box. So this is an argument outside the box, and this is a book published by Keynes in 1940, and it's a book about how to pay the war, but also about inflation and fiscal expansion. And it's a book that sets the argument in a way that it is outside the box. And in this book, Keynes, which summarizes articles that has prepared from the press, puts forward a very interesting argument. So he says that, the war in the UK is a special condition, and you have expansion of production because you need to support the war. But this expansion of the production comes with a reduction of the consumer of goods. So you have less goods to consume, but more production. So higher production, and given that we are in a war condition, which there are soldiers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, will lead to higher wages because of higher demand for labor. And higher wages, if conditions stays like that, not because of the aggregate demand, but because of the special condition in which the aggregate demand will be implemented, will lead to inflation. And inflation will be redistribution of profits against the labor. So how can we get out of this condition? So Keynes said we need to invest the surplus purchasing power. So he was against inflation, so as a solution. He was against taxation, actually, as a solution. So he was against inflation. He was not positive about taxation. How much time do I have, Daniele?
5 minutes, Dimitris.
5 minutes, that's fine. And he said that we need to find a way. So we need to find a way in order for workers to save in post office savings banks, financial society, trade unions, in order to get part of the future growth. And in a way, this is what's happening today. It's a financial repression with, some Keynesian element, because this is a figure that shows the change of UK assets and net worth, the cumulative change as ratio to GDP. And as you can see, from the end of the pandemic, there is some sort of compulsory saving, which saving has become part of bank accounts, which is deposits, financial market. And you see the jump in the real, the net worth, it's tremendous. And this is not money, this is not the average, this is income inequality. So this is savings and invested savings in the future, let's say, of the economy, but in favor of, the wealthy or middle classes or wealthy parts of the society on average. So it's a condition, let's say, a special condition of or one of the effects of what financial depression means in under the contemporary condition of urban market. So I will try to finish here, and I would say that the problem is not debt as itself. in its own rights. That can be sustainable or unsustainable. I think the problem is that we face an unsustainable mix of questions and dilemmas, and this will create a ground of huge political conflicts and class struggles in the years to come, and that will define perhaps our lives to a significant extent. So fiscal expansion is not inflationary, but in order to stay non-inflationary, it has to increase inequality, which, you know, it's a very, very risky or dangerous trade-off. So one can be happy that, you know, you don't go to huge inflation, but, you know, financial repression under moderate conditions, in order not to have inflation, it boosts inequality. The second is that sovereign debt overhang cannot be addressed or sustained without some kind of financial repression with open markets. And given that financialization cannot be undone, so we cannot return to the 50s or 60s for many different reasons, we need to figure out how is to live in an environment of low real yields and perhaps significant central bank interventions. Low real yields, since, for instance, may seem aggressive risk-taking, means push for more financialization, means that change and, you know, financialization, more financialization of pension funds or all, you know, social security related funds, etc., which will be a huge push for a reform in the next time, and something that we need to take into consideration. And then there will be the struggle of austerity. So austerity could be back on the agenda, and then the question is that what can we say about austerity? How can we stop austerity? So can we have a progressive environment of, you know, taxation, or all these questions? And finally, you know, it's like climate change, rising inequality, these big issues in society. So how can the state, or an very indebted state, deal with, you know, the big challenges if the state cannot utilize resources in that way? So I think that, you know, this I will stop here. I don't have more time, but I think this is a very explosive, very dangerous mix. We need, you know, political economists. We need to start discussing about these issues, because they will stay with us for a long time and will define the agenda of political debate and social movements in the years to come. So thanks, and I will stop here.
Thank you, Dimitris, for very good introduction of the macro issues, I think, at play in these times. So thanks very much. I hope you noted down your questions for later. Now we have Leslie.
Thanks very much for the invite. It's a real pleasure to be on the platform with Dimitris and Danielle and talk about fiscal expansion. They've both added, with people like Matt and other colleagues, to the intellectual expansion that's happened in the business school in the last 10 years. And I did say at a meeting at our professoriate that the next person I heard in the Open University calling it a neoliberal business school, I'd punch their lights out, because it's crass, but also wrong. And the business school does have a lot of interesting things to say about the world and be much more current. And as members of the Open University, we have to live up to the decision that the Vice Chancellor has made to call us a social institution. Right, let me go to my introductory remarks. So firstly, I want to make some remarks. So there's a set of remarks. So the part of this webinar relates to UK capitalism and invites some remarks. Now, Colin Hayes' 2020 paper states that capitalisms vary, but the variety of capitalism's literature of Hall and Soskis is very limited because its ideal configuration. It's either a liberal market economy or it's a coordinated liberal economy, and there's quite profound ontological and epistemologies with that. And But the UK is one of the most unbalanced economies, both in terms of wealth, income, and its spatial distribution, and has suffered more of a double whammy from Brexit and COVID-19 than many of its European neighbours. The EU released some figures the other day that the impact was 4 times as much for the UK than the EU by 2024. And the imbalances tend to be compounded by the dominance of rentier over industrial fractions of capital. And we see that in the kind of divisions between Remain and Leave supporters amongst those fractions. The other issue is that COVID-19 is a demand and a supply shock, compounding the legacy of the global financial crisis and the pursuit of austerity. Long-term impacts on the neighbouring EU regions and Celtic nations are compounded by the differential impacts of COVID pandemic, to which a lot of the remarks that Dimitris made are apposite. Now, one of the big things that's not looked at is the role of transaction costs. We've seen this with the NI protocol and some of the issues arising from the EU Withdrawal Act, which only focuses on trade and not services. And the challenge will be, will these apparent teething problems turn into structural problems for the long term, for an unbalanced and damaged economic model that is the UK? For those who are not economists, transaction costs are what Kenneth Arrow calls the cost of doing business. There are frictions associated with using the market, and they affect buyers and sellers, and they exist on both sides of the market. And I do find it extraordinary that someone in the Treasury hasn't perhaps been tutoring the Cabinet on transaction costs, because they've had a much bigger impact. Now, in the UK, whatever happens post-Brexit and post-19, without greater devolution and decentralisation, you are going to see the breakup of the union. I'll come back to that. But the focus on levelling up of supposedly left behind places, rather than levelling down in the wealthier metropolitan regions, of which Calvin Jones, friend and colleague at University of Cardiff, has done a lot of, it doesn't address the canard of London subsidising the other English regions. If you do a proper calculus and a balance sheet, it's nonsense. There's various reasons. But, and again, I'm happy to discuss that in detail, but probably outside this webinar. But what is interesting is there's cross-cutting socio-economic, political and constitutional changes needed if the union is to hold. I'll come back to that. Okay. Now, what we've seen is the rise and fall of regional shock absorbers. So post GFC fiscal conservatism and austerity in the Eurozone and the UK undermined the logic of conventional macroeconomic policy functions of allocation, distribution, and stabilisation of resources, ending what was called the Great Moderation. And again, Dimitris has picked up of these in a more macro sense. Now, the new normal is hardly normal, reinforcing volatility in pursuit of risky assets. And again, we've seen this, and I made a comment earlier that if you look at the ending of COVID-19, the kind of North London bourgeois bohemians that some of us belong to, unfortunately, are going to be able to have better holidays, and our house prices, the economic rents, which should be taxed, by the way, will go up. The regional policy, by having standard merit or public good distribution, health, education, and so on, has been undone by the postcode lottery, further exposed by Brexit and COVID-19. So if you're unfortunate to get COVID-19 or get ill, you're really best to be ill in London. I mean, we've got 3 world-class teaching hospitals in 5 miles of us, and they were fully staffed and had full equipment for the COVID-19. That wasn't the same in many of the so-called left behind places which supported Brexit. So what we've got is this unhealthy combination of post-GFC, Brexit and COVID-19, reinforcing the hysteresis of regional imbalances, people's livelihoods, well-being, and so on and so forth. Notwithstanding that, again, which Dimitris referred to, global challenges that face us all in terms of climate change and the kind of places we want to live in. I'm often critical of smart cities literature because I point out that London's actually is a dumb city in the levels of child asthma it's got because it has too many polluting vehicles. So the kind of Leninist question that I've asked, is there a kind of Schumpeterian solution of creative destruction of new or existing propulsive industries in places using these shocks to restructure the economy? I'm not optimistic, but we'll come to that. So let's take Brexit. Now, there's complex reasons for Brexit that cross-cut social, economic, identity, age differences, not just left behind places. Many wealthy people in the southeast, and maybe associated more with financial services of a certain age, voted for Brexit. And that was partly, again, to do with asset insurance, whereby the economic impact would be less because their assets would be inflated, often having defined benefit pension schemes and not being directly hit by Brexit, apart from maybe transaction costs of their golfing holidays and the wherever it is in Portugal. Sorry, just lost. Now, the problem is, as Martin Sanders said in the FT, Brexit is a problem in search of a solution, but it's not an answer to the faults and weaknesses of the UK model. And I've given some bullet points there. And these complex reasons meet the kind of outcomes of what I call the long duration of the path-dependent weaknesses in the UK and its productivity problem that's being exposed by sort of lockdowns of certain activities which are low paid and often subject to insecure employment. And the characteristics of this economic model are they're being amplified at regional scales, and that's why the concentration on regions. But the sectoral differences in support of Brexit was actually, with reliance on European supply chains, was most negatively affected by Brexit. But there were some paradoxes. Male workers with low formal education, depending on jobs in good producing sectors, relying on EU supply chains and housing, at least in London and the South East, as a form of self-insurance against the Brexit shocks. Again, we can give an example. If you look at Nissan in Sunderland and Airbus in North Wales, the managers voted to remain. They told their staff that these plants were vulnerable to shutdown or slimming down in the event of Brexit. And most of the polling of those workers showed that the majority of workers voted for Brexit, showing it just wasn't the economy. Go on. Now, this is some of the impacts. So this is the Office for Budget Responsibility. Differences due to real GDP to central forecasts due to Brexit. And the line is the reduction in GDP, but you've got structural unemployment, border distribution, which is low. Again, it depends on how the GB-NI situation is addressed and possibly or possibly not resolved. The long-running productivity, and that seems to be expanding as we go further forward. Capital deepening. Now, capital deepening is fixed capital assets, and perhaps post COVID-19, the use of things like Teams, AI, and what comes under what's called Industry 4.0. And there's other short-term effects. Now, if we look at this is from the IFS Green Budget. And the IFS does sterling work, but I do wish they'd learn some macroeconomics. But this is quite a useful table. So you can see the shares of GVA by the various sectors, the total trade, this is 2017, percentage of trade, and then you've got the Treasury FTA, which is effectively the deal we've got, no deal, and this is Citibank Research FTA, they for comparison. Then you've got the EU tariffs, which will be under WTO regulations. There's no such thing as WTO terms, by the way. And then, actually, sorry, the rudimentary deal is what we've got, and no deal. And they're all kind of losses up to 2030. Now, what I've called this slide is the rise of the Millwall tendency. The Millwall tendency is named after the famous English Championship club that had a reputation for football hooligans and violence, creating fans mantra, everyone hate us and we don't care. And that's redolent of some ultra Brexiteers, but it might be something in the kind of English culture, I don't know. But that just gives some of the impacts not only on trade, but services and GDP. And this economic impact of Brexit deal after 10 years compared to is the recent UK, taken from the recent UK and Changing Europe report on the overall impacts of Brexit, which is very worth reading, you can dip in out of. But you can actually see the net benefits. And again, the same language of everyone hates us, we don't care, take back control, and French connection business by our Prime Minister. Now, if you look at the regional impact of Brexit, you can actually see it declines as you get further south. So we all expect rent-free holidays in Sparta in future when Dimitris cashes in his expensive London house and buys a big one for us to stay in. But this is based on input-output tables. It's not only UK regions, but it's northern regions of Belgium, France, Netherlands, and so on and so forth. So it's not just the UK. Now, this was taken from a leaked report that was never made public. And the government, again, was economical with the truth in 2018 when it said there was actually no impact study. And that is the three scenarios. So if we'd have gone for a European economic area deal there with a kind of GDP up to 2028, a free trade agreement, and a WTO, which is no deal. And that just reinforces the already regional imbalances we've already got. And there's localized, there's also a sub-regional impacts in terms of GDP per head in sub-regions and winners and losers. And it is very interesting that if you look at West Wales in fishing, 80% of all its catches goes to the EU. And as we've seen with fishing, and the OU is doing a program on fishing in Cornwall at the moment, it's been severely damaged and is unlikely to survive, in my view, despite claims to the contrary by, should I say, people who know better or should know better. Now, unlike the GFC, COVID is a demand and supply shock, as we've seen. But the health versus economy is not apposite as a discourse, despite the claims of some public figures and the same people who were in the European Research Group have now formed the COVID recovery group. And I don't see one clinician or epidemiologist amongst them, but again, that might be my personal prejudice for expertise. Given the vaccine rolls out and increased international contribution, which there has to be, maybe soon about bounce back by sector in some regions, but clearly not all. And following on from Dimitris's comments about inequality and financial repression, it's likely in the first instance to reinforce inequality. Now, this is taken from a IFS report in June on the regional impact, and it just shows, again, as you'd expect, the infections per 10,000 were in the poorest regions, those most affected by Brexit we showed earlier. That's the distributions of deaths, slightly different outcome. The one in Dorset at the bottom has a lot to do with the age profile and the way in which COVID-19 was reported. So my father-in-law died in April. He was at a care home. It went on his death certificate, it said dementia and COVID-19, but they couldn't test him. So I'm not questioning the clinicians, but I suspect in at least Dorset, many of the deaths, excuse me, were associated with vulnerability due to age and so on and so forth. It has the longest longevity of anywhere in the UK. Now, this is life expectancy of males and females by region, by males by region, and this slide will be available, but you can actually see that average life expectancy associated wealth, income, occupation, and where you live. Similarly, for the rate is the slope is slightly less for females, but it is interesting in the breakout of the least the most deprived areas and those kind of death rates. And this is just the variations in vulnerability to health. So people in poor regions, as you'd expect, poor regions which are subject to the biggest impact of Brexit and COVID-19 have the worst health outcomes. But this, I think, is an interesting slide, and it relates to the sort of lockdown and isolation and mental health issues. You can see the distribution for vulnerability to COVID-19 is in, again, the poor regions for workers. But if workers are have families, then that mitigates some of the effects. So there's some self-caring going on, and there's a kind of informal household economy, which I suspect is increased in COVID. I would like to look up the evidence of that, and I will seek it in the future. So this slide is just the sectoral and regional impacts of Brexit and COVID-19. So they also cross-cut at sub-regional levels, as I said. Poverty in its age, gender, race, and identity distribution, the largest groups affected by COVID-19. I was personally offended when he talked about people from black and ethnic minorities suffering most from COVID-19 because of something genetic. My view is, and I think there's some support of that in occupational health, is they are actually often amongst the poorest communities doing jobs that are most exposed to COVID, bus driving, care homes, nursing, and so on and so forth. And who have to, under pressure, to not socially isolate, say they travel to work, and you can see that in pictures of the London Shoe.
Sorry, Les.
Yeah, well, I'm nearly there.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes. So
yeah.
Fine.
So again, I said low workers, formal education dependent on jobs, heavily reliant on EU supply chains, and wealthier as self-insurance. But clearly these two factors have exacerbated poverty, and you can see that. So those kind of sectors, COVID-19, have been those low-wage, insecure type activities, but also, if you like, from which the derived demand comes from more value-added sectors like manufacturing, transport, equipment, and so on and so forth. And they're being hit by COVID. So there's a double whammy for those people in those lower occupations, because demands for their services and the goods and services they may sell on behalf of hospitality tourist firms has diminished. So the dilemma of levelling up or down, the promise of post-COVID devolution. despite the evidence that causes of Brexit are more manifold, the left behind places discourse still dominates policy. UK government stress on levelling up places in COVID and post-COVID and post-Brexit environment, but it's still a slogan. There's little bits of money. Homogeneous policy response with ad hoc and small funding to what is a very heterogeneous set of policies. All infrastructure are not the same. Regionally based industrial policy has been now downgraded, it's reported, with the UK government favouring competition over industrial policy. But again, I don't see, without some kind of regionally based industrial policy, how these variants of the contract states, city deals, combined authorities, local enterprise partnerships can make much difference, given, again, austerity cut local authority budgets severely over the last 15 years. As I said, with these kind of institutions, you've got incoherent and incoherent regional policy, ad hoc reforms, little or no institutional changes or funding instruments, things like regional bond markets, regional stock exchange, which could make a difference. And the other thing about Brexit is ignoring the Sewell Convention for Devolved Nations consultation over Brexit and the centralising instinct to manage COVID-19 tends to undermine English devolution, of which there are rising demands. So, to quote one of my favourite singers, Sam Cooke, where's the change going to come from? There's a chorus, there's a vague political commitment to levelling up, but beyond slogans, there doesn't seem much political appetite for levelling down richer metro regions, i.e. the rentier cities of London and Manchester. And finally, there's various perverse incentives. Structural problems or teething problems with customs regularly change from the EU Withdrawal Act and the NIP. I suspect it will be the former, and actually is resolving the own goal of von Leyen, the EC over vaccine imports, has actually allowed Article 16 to raise the possibility of overthrowing the withdrawal or changing the Withdrawal Act, and actually boosted for Northern Ireland the political weaknesses of the DUP that actually were effectively the authors or the architects of the border down the Irish Sea. There's no agreement on services, and we've seen New York's Euronext shifting its equity and commissions trading to Amsterdam, suggesting London may become a less attractive site for rentier interest, particularly real estate, depending how the kinds of changes in employment practices we have post-COVID. There's an ideological aversion to public debt and rising private debt, again, as Dimitris has shown, incomplete coverage and timing of Brexit rescue packages, the risk of reversing policy too soon and causing a return to austerity, which there is appetite in the ruling party. So the Leninist question of what could be done could be answered by a combination of constitutional commission to change electoral system, formal institutionalization of decentralization and devolution to promote the principle of subsidiarity and social solidarity. Now, you could argue that's naive, but the irony would be, with no union, with a UK capitalism and its failing economic model, if you don't do something about rebalancing and redistribution. And in the context of the discourse of the Green New Deal, which is a discourse, and something like Industry 4.0 strategies, in the face of global challenges to manage locally, using new financial institutions and instruments. So there's a, amongst younger generation particularly, there's an appetite for change, but there's going to have to be some fundamental institutional changes and address some of the serious structural problems of the UK economy. And as I said, although the opportunity to remodelising political strategy of reindustrialising, devolve centralising institutions to manage and fund restructuring of most unbalanced developed economy, Labour Party, please note well, rather than playing with flags, it could take a long time, but if we have the breakup of Britain, as Tom Nairn's great book, 78, that may occur. Thanks very much.